welcome. My name is Rochelle Davis. I'm the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, for those of you that don't know me, and an associate professor of anthropology. I want to start out, this event and most of our events are made possible by a Title VI grant from the U.S. Department of Education, which gives us funding to be a national resource center on the Middle East and North Africa here at Georgetown University. And so that's your tax dollars at work, so thank you very much. And we get other funding from a variety of generous donors for our public events series. So, it's a real sort of honor and pleasure to have Dr. Wendy Pearlman here with us this evening. And she's a professor of political science at Northwestern University, and she specializes in comparative politics of the Middle East. She received her bachelor's degree from Brown and then her doctorate from Harvard University, and she's conducted research in Spain, Germany, Morocco, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Palestine, and Israel. And she is the author of 4 books. Her first book is called Occupied Voices, Stories of Everyday Life from the Second Intifada, which was published in 2003. Her second book, which won an award, is called Violence, Nonviolence, and the Palestinian National Movement in 2011. Her third book is the one you're going to hear about today, but before I get to that one, I want to talk about her fourth book, which is called Triadic Coercion, Israel's Targeting of States that Host Non-State Actors. And that just came out in 2008, and she co-authored it with Boaz Atzivi. So her book that she's going to speak with us about today is called We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria. It's available outside for sale if you'd like. You probably all saw that. It's $18.01, which includes the tax. And this book, I'm sure you're all here because you've all either read it in classes, it's been assigned to you, or because it has been widely acclaimed in the New York Times Book Review, The Guardian, Vice, and a variety of other places, authors, etc. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wendy Pearlman.
Can everyone hear me okay? I mean, even if I go a little bit far away? Great, then I won't have to. Thank you so much for coming and spending Valentine's Day with us all. And thank you for being here. So the last book that Dr. Davis just mentioned just came out, and I did a talk about it this morning, so I'm still having a bit of whiplash from going from triadic coercion, Israel's targeting of states that host non-state actors, back to human narratives of the Syrian uprising and war. So thank you for coming here for that. So a bit of the background to this book. I began studying the Middle East in the mid-1990s during a college semester abroad in North Africa, and many of you maybe have come to the Middle East in that way. I later went on, before I ended up doing my PhD at Harvard, I started in the PhD program in the government department upstairs. So I think the last time I was in this room, I was taking a seminar with Michael Hudson and reading Overstating the Arab State. So it's with fond memories I come back to this very seminar room. So like many regional specialists, but probably like all of you, when the Arab uprisings began in 2011, I was just captivated. Maybe after having read so much about Arab authoritarianism, to see this moment of people's power, people going out into the streets, I was absolutely enthralled. And as we all watched protests, and the protest wave moved from Tunisia to Egypt to other countries in the region, many at the time, and as many of you might remember, said, Syria is a kingdom of silence. The regime is too strong, the army is so infused with the regime, unlike in other Arab states. People have been intimidated by a history of state violence. These revolutions might go everywhere else in the region, but not Syria. So when Syrians defied those expectations and did go out into the streets, I really wanted to know how and why, and I wanted to know what it felt like for them. I figured there was no better way to find out what it was like for them than to go and ask Syrians themselves. So that began a multi-year experience of interviewing Syrian refugees, displaced Syrians, about their experiences. I got my first chance in 2012 when I went to Jordan for a summer, and then I've continued interviewing displaced Syrians across the Middle East and eventually in Europe until as late as last summer when I spent another 3 months doing an interview trip. So by the time I got started, it already felt quite dangerous to go inside Syria and have frank, totally honest conversations about politics and revolution and so forth. So I began to interview Syrians who had left the country. My interviews ranged from maybe a 20, 30-minute conversation to sometimes group discussions where several people would speak amongst themselves and I was there audio recording, to long oral histories that lasted over hours or over days, and sometimes now have lasted over years and over continents, because as much as possible I tried to still stay in touch with people and be able to see something about how their lives have evolved over time. And I worked through a kind of a snowball method of connecting through as many entry points as I could to different types of social networks, trying as much as possible to speak with people of different ages, genders, socioeconomic class backgrounds, from all different hometowns and villages inside Syria. But the majority of people with whom I spoke were critical of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And this is largely because I began with a special focus on protest, being my first initial research question, and then my research networks got stronger and stronger among communities of people who identified in some way with the opposition, although they had plenty of criticisms of the opposition as well. So in that way, I can say this does not represent the full spectrum of Syrian opinion. I don't know if any single work could, but I think it represents a part of the population that meets with too few opportunities to represent itself. Those who in some ways cheered and championed this uprising as it went out, and then had their experiences evolve over time. So as I did all of these interviews and as I continue to do them, there's a ton of diversity and difference and debate, but there's also ways in which the narratives, the individual narratives, coalesce into a collective narrative. There's a lot there that's shared that I think expresses some kind of collective, common Syrian experience. So the book that I've written tries to express that common, shared narrative. The introduction is in my voice, providing some basic historical context, and then the rest of the book is exclusively a curation of excerpts of the interviews that I did. So if you open it up, it goes name, story, arranged chronologically to try to walk a reader through something of what Syria was like before 2011, how the uprising began, how it evolved, up into the present, but solely through one voice to another, one story to another, all as I was able to record in these interviews. So in that, to give a sort of sense for those of you who are coming from more an academic perspective and interested in the kind of methodology, I can say that the work that I did sort of consisted of what I would say four interpretive tasks. The first was that I actually had to do the interviews, and then I worked with an entire team of transcribers and translators to get from the typically audio recorded Arabic to written English. Then once I had those transcripts, I went through them and read to look for key themes and key events, patterns that emerged, sort of scrutinizing the transcripts, and it was a software program called Scrivener that helped me put file folders and folders within file folders to make sense of things, events, issues that I heard repeatedly. Once I could see these major themes and issues, that identified for me the pieces that needed to be there in the book. That I thought, if this was the things that come out repeatedly in the interviews I did, a book that gave expression to what I heard should cover these points. I then had to cull excerpts that could represent each of those points. If I had maybe 10 people talking about a particular kind of experience, which one would I choose to kind of represent that experience in the course of this sequence, moving on from one experience to another. And then when I had these array of excerpts that were chosen so that the ones that had sort of the most vivid, lived detail that really not just described or referred to an event, but showed it in a lived way, but also trying to balance voices of different demographics of men and women and people from different backgrounds and so forth, then the job was to arrange them in a sequence. And there were certainly more than one kind of order of a way to give to these narratives. I chose a chronological narrative that just reflected my own not only reflected my own understanding, also reflected people's describing their own personal narratives in a chronological way, moving from one event in their life to another, but also in a way that would tell a history, that would move step by step, piece by piece, and give a kind of oral history of this experience. So what I'd like to share with you today then are some selections that give you a sense of that historical arc, give you a taste for some of the voices that are in the book. But knowing that some of you have already read the book, or that you're very familiar with this history yourselves, I thought, if I'm coming to CCAS, I need to up my game a little bit, not just give the basics. So, in that I'd like to present maybe one methodological question that some of you might think about as I go through this talk, which was a question that I thought about coming to this kind of work as a political scientist. And that was, how can storytelling, because ultimately what I was collecting was people telling stories about themselves. And I feel ultimately what I constructed was a kind of story, a meta story told from these smaller stories. But in the end of the day, my day job is to be a political scientist. What can storytelling give to the study of Middle East politics? Is there anything that the study of Middle East politics and scholarship on Middle East politics can give to the art of storytelling? So that's a kind of a methodological, more academic level, if that interests you. And if not, just come along with me for the story. So I'll kind of walk through a little bit of what the arc of this book is like. So the book begins, again, coming from a political angle of organizing sort of political phases. It begins with experiences of authoritarianism before 2011. So in 1970s, after decades of coups and instability, Hafez al-Assad seized power in Syria and established a strong authoritarian regime. There is a lot to say about how he used coalitions and policies and economic policies and structures and institutions to solidify this strong authoritarian regime. But the stories in this book give more voice to the personal lived experience of authoritarianism from a citizen's point of view. And these stories talk about how there was a sense of, for many citizens, no space for criticism, a threat of violence for those who dared to oppose. And for people I talked to again and again, this was personified, symbolized, embodied in the collective memory surrounding the events of Hama in 1982, which people, of course, might refer to as Hama, as the 1980s, as the events. This, of course, referring to how the regime began to face various forms of armed and unarmed opposition in the late 1970s to the early 1980s, culminating in something of an armed insurrection led by the Muslim Brotherhood and other offshoot groups in the town of Hama, that the regime suppressed with a kind of scorched earth policy, sending in tanks, troops, aerial bombardment, flattening entire parts of this town, in many ways warning a generation or generations, this is what the regime might do to those who dared to challenge it. So the Syrian stories that I collected emphasize how the kind of hazy memory of this event, passed down in whispers, became a part of people's everyday lives, and a sense that a single ruling political party, an omnipresent security apparatus, a network of covert informants, all combined to police society and encourage society to police itself. Here, let me share with you the words of Ilyas, a dentist from rural Hama. And Ilyas said, "Syria had the appearance of being a stable country, but in my opinion, it wasn't real stability. Nobody trusted anyone else. People would say, 'Don't talk, the walls have ears.' If anyone said anything out of the ordinary, others would suspect that he was a government informant, just trying to test people's reactions and gather a sense of what was going on. It's a regime based on command and obedience. Every state institution recreated the same kind of power. The president had absolute power in the country. The principal of a school had absolute power in the school. At the same time, the principal is terrified of whom? Of the janitor sweeping the floor, because they're all government informants." Some talked about how this kind of disposition to silence, the sense that you didn't know who was listening, so it was better simply not to talk about politics, could be so internalized it might even stay with people after they left the country, shaping their own sense of self. So here let me share with you the words of Hussam, who left the suburbs of Damascus as a child, describing other interactions with Syrians who might be traveling out of the country in the 1980s, the 90s, the early 2000s, maybe on vacation, traveling, and so forth. And he said, when you meet somebody coming out of Syria for the first time, you start to hear the same sentences. Everything is okay, Syria is a great country, the economy is doing great. It'll take him like 6 months, up to a year, to become a normal human being, to say what he thinks, what he feels. After all that time, even outside Syria, you feel that someone is recording. Bashar al-Assad came to power in the year 2000 after his father's death, and in the stories I collected, again and again people emphasize how they really hoped that this young, educated head of state would make reform and change, and he presented himself as a modernizer and a reformer. And then as people's stories continue, they emphasize that what changed most of all was perhaps life in the economic realm and the shift from a more state-dominated economy to a more market-oriented economy that in many ways allowed for new forms of conspicuous corruption and decreased the quality of public services and infrastructure for others. But that threat of punishment remained. And as the new spaces for corruption emerged, the ways that corruption and co-optation and sort of use of money as part of political relationships that had arguably always been a part of politics, for some people became even more apparent. So to get to this element, another element of people's lived political reality, here are the words of Iham. And he said, you grow up with this in your head. We love the leader, we love the regime, without them the country will collapse. But even as an innocent child, you could see that the whole system just reeked. It fed on corruption and grew. If you want to get a passport, you have to bribe this guy and that guy. From when you're little, you're taught that this is the only way to survive in this country. As an active member of the ruling party, you're going to get better grades, better chances for better schools or jobs. Everything is handled by how loyal you are. So you're raised on the principle that you have to show your loyalty. For sure, there were transgressions, and as our colleague Lisa Woodine, among others, have documented, people may have stood up to power in different ways, pushed the boundaries of what was political acceptable in different ways, and how this changed over the years. But for most of the people I met, there was simply a sense that both corruption and repression limited the horizons of political possibility. To hope for change in these years simply seemed foolish. Naive, was never going to happen. To actually fight for change, reckless. It would probably only get you and also your family members in the most terrible types of trouble and danger. As expressed by one student, whose words are the entry to the book, a Syrian citizen is just a number. Dreaming is not allowed. Until, of course, Syrians dare to dream. And this, for the people I interviewed who in some ways participated in or supported the uprising, is what the uprising meant to them. So the book uses a series of stories and anecdotes for people describing first as they heard about the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere, they followed on the news, discussed and debated with their friends, will it happen in Syria, maybe yes, maybe no, and then a few tentative demonstrations slowly kicked off a cascade that spread over space, that was sustained over time, kicking off a national revolt that called first only for reform of the given political system, and then eventually of transformation and the overthrow of the political system. I'm happy to talk about those developments and how this uprising technically, mechanically, sort of happened, which I think is fascinating in its own right. But today we'll just read a few excerpts that describe what comes through even more forcefully in the interviews that I've collected, what protest meant to those who participated in it. And I think that is best captured in an expression that was ubiquitous in Syria and throughout the Arab uprisings in general, that people broke the barrier of fear. And what comes through in people's stories is not that fear ever disappeared. The threat was always there. the people mustered the capacity to work through fear. To feel fear would go out and take action and take risk anyway. What was that like? Let me share with you the words of Shireen, a mother from Aleppo. And Shireen said, oppression was residing in us. It was part of our life, like air, sun, water. We didn't even feel it. Like air is there, and you never ask, where is the air? But then, in 1 second, in one shout, in one voice, you blow it up. Don't even imagine that it was easy to go out to demonstrations. No amount of courage allows you to just stand there and watch someone who has a gun and is about to kill you. But still, this oppression made us go out. I encouraged my nieces and nephews to come with me to demonstrations. I felt that if they didn't try that experience, they'd be missing the real meaning of life. When you chant, you shudder, and your body rises, and everything you imagined just comes out. Tears come down, tears of joy, because I broke the barrier. I am not afraid. I am a free being. Sadness and happiness and fear and courage, they're all mixed together in that voice. And it comes out strong. Before the revolution, Syria was just the place where I lived, but it didn't belong to me. When the revolution began, I discovered that Syria was my country. Nearly everyone with whom I spoke who participated in demonstrations identified it as an experience that was not simply emotional, but transformative. I would ask people to describe their first demonstration. And what people said most frequently was la tusif. It's simply indescribable. You can't put into words what it felt like. And I would say, I'm writing a book. Can you try to put it into words? And people would say things like, it was the first time I breathed, the first time I felt like a human, the first time I felt like a citizen. One man said, it was better than my wedding day. And when my wife heard that, she refused to speak to me for a month. I think this sense that it was like the first time is for me best captured in perhaps one of my favorite testimonial from the book, from a writer named Rima, who said, I was in a demonstration and I started to whisper, freedom. And then I started to hear myself repeating, freedom, freedom, freedom. And then I started shouting, freedom. And I thought, this is the first time I have ever heard my own voice. And I told myself that I would never let anyone steal my voice again. This, I think, is what the uprising meant to those transformed by it, or participating in it, or championing it. As the book moves on from life before 2011 to these early phases of mostly nonviolent protests, the next stage that it walks through is that of the militarization of the uprising and its evolution to this multi-sided brutal war that continues until today. So as we know, protests remained overwhelmingly nonviolent for many months. The regime responded with various forms of violence. The opposition eventually took up arms. Those who did take up arms and became part of this armed revolt also explained their points of view. Let me share with you the words of a Free Syrian army fighter, who at least was at one point, who goes by the name Captain. Captain said, when demonstrations began, security forces came. We agreed that if they were going to shoot bullets, then we needed weapons too. We were only chanting in the streets. We could have chanted for the rest of our lives without anyone even paying attention to us. But when the regime started attacking us, a lot of people who were on the sidelines started to join and protest too, because of the blood, Blood is what moves people. Blood is the force of the revolution. As this armed rebellion expanded, regime also escalated its reprisals. State and non-state actors became involved in this increasingly fragmented situation, and this internationalized, regionalized, multi-sided brutal war escalated onward. There's a lot to say about that for sure. One thing I'd like to talk about now is the experience of civilians living war. And what I see coming through in the stories people talk about everyday life in war zones is almost two contradictory sorts of experiences. On the one hand, war is terror, people would say. People describe the shelling and the bombing. Many talked about how the sounds of war, waiting and hearing the buzzing of planes overhead, is as horrible as the actual explosions. So there's no way to describe or experience it beyond sheer terror and horror. On the other hand, there's a kind of normalization of terror, a kind of normalization to death, knowing that you can't escape it, that it's there every time. You simply get used to it when there's no other way, no other place to go, and it becomes the backdrop to daily life. So I think there's a lot to say about this normalization of life in war and terror. It's still a lot to be studied about how it affects people in an enduring way, and how that endured trauma shapes people in entire communities. And maybe it's something that we'll continue to see for years or generations to come. Let me just give you a couple of senses of how I saw this kind of normalization come through in people's stories. But first, let me share with you the words of Abu Faras from Idlib, who talked about a kind of immunity to shock. So this will sound true to some of you who experienced. And Abu Faras said, at first, 1 or 2 people were killed, then 20. Then it became normal. If we lost 50 people, we'd say, thank God, it's only 50. It's been so long since I heard that someone died of natural causes. Another way I think you see this kind of normalization to the abnormal is in humor. And there I think is still a lot to be said about the role of humor and satire in the Syrian conflict, which you can see in every imaginable medium, and some of you might follow some of the humor that is being produced and still being produced. To give you just one little sense of this, to close here, words not from an interview I collected, but from something that one of my interlocutors posted on Facebook one day. So Shafiq posted on Facebook, the most important and beautiful thing about the revolution is that people rid themselves of the words, hush, the walls had ears. To which one of his friends commented on the post, yeah, that's true, but there are no more walls left anyway. Everything's gone. There's still much more to say about the normalization of war, but I'll continue following the phases of this kind of chronological arc. For the people who I met, after experiencing authoritarianism, revolution, and war, the next stage of their lives and their journeys was that of displacement. And I collected all sorts of stories about the journey of how someone becomes a refugee, what's the decision and the events that leads a person to flee, the challenges and hopes after one becomes a displaced person. There are many, many stories. All emphasize that the struggle does not end when someone reaches a point of relative safety. It's rather a new cycle of challenges that come underway. First, though, just to give you a sense of some numbers to put it all in perspective. At this point, it's understood that more than half of the pre-war population of 22 million has been displaced. This is already a year old, this graph, but gives you some sense of the geographic dispersion. Estimated, the numbers are always changing, some 6.6, 6.8 million Syrians are internally displaced. They've been forced to flee their homes but remain within the borders of Syria, might be renting an apartment, might be living in an IDP camp, full range there. About 5.6 million Syrians are refugees in the Middle East, the largest number in Turkey, smaller numbers in Lebanon, Jordan, and elsewhere. Approximately 1 million Syrians are seeking asylum or have received asylum in Europe, with the largest number there in Germany, followed by Sweden. and puts in perspective that there's something like, since 2011, about, whoops, that's missing a zero, about 21,000 refugees have been resettled in the United States to the refugee resettlement program. So that's, can we just pause a little bit with those numbers? So as I was saying, there's so many different stories about displacement, the causes, the coping, and so forth. There are lots of different stories. They, in what I've experienced, vary tremendously depending on where people have wound up, what age and generation there are, what socioeconomic background they come with. So it's hard to choose one story that can in any way be emblematic of an experience of displacement. So instead, what I'd like to share with you now is something sort of selfishly that is what I'm thinking to do in my next project. So this is where I'd be eager for any sort of feedback. I found in the stories that I'm collecting a kind of struggle with what does it mean to be Syrian now? What is home? What is homeland? What is exile? To what do I, as a Syrian, or to what do we belong? Given that the home that was left might no longer exist in the way people remember it in their childhoods, given that the future is tremendously uncertain. This is something that I'm fascinated with, because I think captures the experience of millions of people in this moment of displacement now. What is home? What is exile? To what do we belong? And what does all of this provide as a window into changes in identity and maybe the creation of a new wave of a new diasporic population? Again, even here, it's hard to find one excerpt that captures all of this, but as something to get a conversation going on this. Let me share with you the words of Yasmin, who is a woman I met who now is in Sweden. And I think her words here describe some of the pain of having been forced to flee, with some of the nostalgia for what's been lost. And it's just one expression of the kinds of conflicts and contradictory feelings that I think many people are struggling with in this stage. So Yasmin said, "We said goodbye to our country. I was not going to return until it became a homeland for me again. What is a homeland? It's not rocks or trees. It's the humans who build the land. It's where you feel safe. A homeland is your friend who you work with and drink coffee with every morning. And that friend betrayed me for a little money or a better position. I didn't betray my homeland. It betrayed me. It pushed me to leave. When the revolution on corruption turned into a worldwide war, I couldn't consider it a homeland anymore. It became a grave where you die slowly. I served my country. I fulfilled my duties, but didn't receive my rights. Here in Sweden, I fulfill my duties and get my rights in return. This is what a homeland means. I didn't choose Sweden. Sweden chose me. Here, I regained my humanity. My 3 children have become holders of European nationalities. In the future, I will have grandchildren who speak Dutch, Swedish, and Spanish. If they don't learn Arabic, they will be strangers to each other. They won't have any traces of where we came from. They won't be Syrian. And I will live in exile and die in exile." So from authoritarianism to protest, war, and displacement, the last section of the book is called Reflections. And this is a series of passages, of commentaries in which people try to make sense of this tremendous journey that they've lived and are still very much on the path of. And in making sense of what's happened, the people I interviewed articulate pain reflections. These range from a sense of anger against the indifference of the international community to their plight, or as they perceive as the indifference, to a nostalgia for a Syria that they fear is no longer the place of their memories, to an existential instability for a profoundly uncertain future, both on the personal level and on the national level, to, in spite of it all, hope. As people say to me repeatedly, Syrians today are living on hope. Others derive lessons from this experience, and I think some of these are lessons that apply well beyond Syria, well beyond situations of war, lessons about politics, about human nature, about order in general. so here, to give you one of these lessons, let me share with you the words of Adam, a media organizer. And he said, "One of the most profound things that I've learned from this experience, called the Syrian Civil War, is that the process of finding out what a country needs is never clean. Of course, when you're in a stable country with functioning institutions, it's easy to have a moral code. But these values are only possible because other people did dirty things to put that system in place. We opened a Pandora's box. We thought we'd get a present, and what we got was all the evil in this world. Now we need to close the box again, but it's going to take a while. Now I'm working with an NGO that helps the free media inside Syria. I see my job as trying to support people who want to make their dreams come true. But I'm too old to dream now. In a month and a half, I'll be 29. So, to close up, why listen to Syrian testimonials? Why try to study them? Why document them? What can we learn from them from an academic point of view or from as citizens of the world? So there are clearly many different answers to this question, but just as a way of wrapping up, I'll say a few that have come to my mind during this project. One, this is a way of contextualizing current events and future events. Syria has blipped in and out of the headlines now for years. It's difficult to get the context, to know how to make sense of it all. And certainly the human context of all what it means, these numbers we hear reported, these events we hear reported, to contextualize them in a human experience and also a historic experience of their own origins. And that, I think, is one thing that personal narratives can help give us that might be difficult to get in the speed of news reporting. I think that these personal narratives are also a way to kind of infuse policy stances with empathy. There are debates about what the US could have done or should have done in all countries in the world vis-a-vis Syria. What is the role of the international community going forward? There are not necessarily easy answers to any of these questions, but in developing any opinions on policy issues, I hope that we don't lose sight of the ordinary people whose lives have been transformed by these events, who continue to bear the brunt of the actions taken by countries around the world. That empathy is something that also the personal narratives can give us and always remind us of. Third, then, to go back to that one question I posed on a more academic, methodological end, what can storytelling give to scholarship? Here I'll speak from my own background as a political scientist, so my disciplinary bias here might come through. I think that this type of storytelling for the study of politics can help us uncover the details of events, the mechanics of how things happen, how and when and why, the micro level of decisions, whether it's involved in protest or displacement and so forth, going inside people's rationales and their thinkings and the kinds of things that they weigh and the kinds of ways that feelings affect behavior. On the personal level of individuals, what are the decisions that are made that propel political events? And of course, the lived experience of politics, what it all is like, why it matters. The other question, or maybe the vice versa, is there anything that the study of politics can give to storytelling? And this is something I've been thinking about, given that my background is as a political scientist and not someone who writes books that have a more narrative format. But there are probably many different ways, even given the material that I collected, to weave them together in a story. I wove it in a certain way that was informed by theories and concepts that I have absorbed from my own academic study of the Middle East. So I think that one way that we do theory and concept building in the social sciences can almost see the value of our work is in the stories that we might tell. That a political scientist might tell a story, an anthropologist might tell a story that's different from the one a journalist might tell. If our theories and our concepts and our academic background is of use and of insight, the kinds of stories we might try to tell in telling stories should also be insightful. That this is a way that we can use our whatever knowledge or a background we have to construct knowledge and share and communicate knowledge in a different type of medium than traditional academic writing. But most importantly, what I wanted this book to do is simply to respect the kind of courage it took people to even speak and tell these stories to me and to others, and in the millions, inevitable, sort of unending kinds of mediums in which Syrians are expressing themselves with a tremendous creativity today. And in listening to stories, I hope that from those of us based here in the United States, that we approach Syrians and displaced Syrians and refugees in general, not with fear, but also not with pity, but with respect. At least in the stories that I've recorded, people went through dangerous and painful, but also truly courageous journeys to be able to tell their own stories. I think the smallest debt we owe to them is to listen. So I will end there, which gives us, I think, plenty of time for a discussion. Thank you.
Do you want me to take them?
No.
You please, you go ahead if you want.
No. You can go ahead and sit down, but you don't have to stay out of the spotlight any longer. So it'll be easy for me to, if anyone raises their hand. But thank you for. Yep. So anyone has a comment, a question, or please.
So my name is Dana, and I work at CCAS. I'm very curious about the way people who you interviewed felt while telling the story.
Yeah.
So I find myself sometimes, and a lot of times, unable to tell a story about the period between 2011 and 13. This is when I left Syria. Simply because telling the story forces me to remember some of the stuff that I intentionally blocked from my memory in order to be able to live the day-to-day life and survive and just be able to deal with the situation. So I feel sometimes that telling a story perpetuates a pain, or recalling that memory gets you to be in a state where you get a lot of pain and anger that actually obstruct your day-to-day life, or for some people can be a healing process, as we hear in psychology. So I want to hear about your experience and how people actually felt while telling these stories.
Thank you. It is such an important question. So I can say the bulk of the stories that I have that really talk about this period, 2011, 2012, 2013, were interviews that I did in 2012 and 2013. And I didn't realize it at the time, because at the time no one knew how this would end and when it would end. But that's when I gathered the bulk of stories about 2011 itself, at a time when, now looking back, it was still fresh, when many people still told them from a place of optimism that this was going to end in a better way, and many had never told their stories in a way that way before, so they were eager to tell because they were still living a moment in which they held. Even then, of course, it didn't take long for the violence to be felt, but there was a kind of a moment of optimism, and that's when I gathered the bulk of the stories of that was early. As I moved on, sensing exactly the pain that you've discussed, my interviews have become tremendously open, and basically I say, I'm interested in collecting Syrian stories. Essentially, tell me about anything you want to tell me. And with time, it's more and more focused on the current moment. So my interviews now focus on what people are experiencing now. So I've just spent the last 3 summers in Germany, which means I've collected a lot of stories about how hard it is to learn German. And what a pain in the neck the German bureaucracy is. No, I still, from a point of view of really wanting to document the Syrian experience, I have to say that's less interesting to me than what happened in Syria in 2011 and 12 and 13, but precisely for the reason you discuss. I actually cannot even begin to imagine how painful it is to go there, and I would never ask someone to do that, but in leaving it open, some people still do. Some people still do go back and want to tell in detail, maybe because it's therapeutic, maybe because they're still wrestling through it, maybe because they're proud of what they did in those years. But leaving it open, many people don't go back there. So it's been an interesting experience for me. Again, some of my interviews I think are almost less interesting than I wish they would be, but they but there's, I don't know, maybe I'll look back and say as well how interesting it was to hear about one level of German after another. Now I started studying German so I could relate in any way to one story after another about German conjugations of verbs. But it's interesting that when you open it in that way, where people begin and where they go and where they don't go. But I'm glad I captured those early experiences when I did, because if I were simply starting now, I don't think I would get those stories. It would be few who want to tell them. Please.
Did you find, when you mentioned how
Yes.
the lady in Sweden,
Yes.
she was kind of, she had a sense of belonging
Yes.
because she has privileges, more privileges, and she
Yes.
considered it a homeland that she's looking forward to live in with her kids for the future. Did you find, because I also listened to interviews with kids in Germany who were very happy and very excited that they're learning and they are, that they were very happy, like they were very optimistic, as if they did not really struggle. Kids forget and they just heal quickly.
Yeah.
Versus those in refugee camps in Beirut, in Jordan, where they are under very repressive conditions or less privileges, or did you find the difference? Because now it's clicking that. And how do you translate that as an anthropologist?
Wow, yeah, you're absolutely, you put your, I think, thumb on something really important, that I think the experiences that people are having now in this moment of displacement are tremendously varied, and they vary across many different factors. The first thing you mentioned, generation, is I think tremendously important. That kids have a certain resilience, maybe they don't remember that much, they didn't create their entire life in Syria, so they're less pain about what they lost. Whereas some of their parents, it's more difficult to start over, to learn a language, they remember who I was, and maybe are struggling with the fact that they worked their whole life to gain expertise in a particular occupation and have a certain education, and now are struggling, they might not be able to work in that job again. So what does that mean for who they are? If somebody sees himself as an engineer and now doesn't know if he'll ever be an engineer in Sweden again, there's a lot there by generation, because of how easy it is to sort of create life anew. And then of course people in between, people who are in their late teens, their early 20s, that started to begin a life, but can also, it's less costly to start up again. So generation, I think, is hugely important. I think that socioeconomic class also varies, especially to the degree that I think a person's occupation can also really form their identity, a sense of what is lost and who am I, can I be who I was. But the last factor that you sort of pointed to, the environment of the host country where someone is found up, is absolutely enormous. So even in this words from the woman from Sweden saying, in Sweden I found my humanity. I have rights, but I also have duties, and I'm respected. And I think precisely that those who are living in informal tent camps in the Bekaa Valley, where there is literally tents and kids are working rather than going to schools, and there's problems of no clean water, and people are literally freezing to death in the last winter storm. Are not experiencing this here as a place where I've gained my humanity. In Lebanon, huge percentages of Syrian refugees do not even have legal status. They can't afford to pay whatever it is to have legal status, so they're actually living illegally. They might not feel fear of traveling from one place to another. If they cross past a Lebanese army checkpoint, will they be at risk of being apprehended or arrested or even deported and so forth. So every country has its own challenges, and certainly the situation of people in the border countries, I think particularly in Lebanon and Jordan. I haven't spent time in Iraq, so I'm not as familiar with that. It's difficult to feel like you're starting life, a new life, anew, because in many ways you're sort of still in this sort of middle zone. Besides the fact without any kind of legal status, there's the real threat that people do not have a legal permission to remain there indefinitely. And at what point will they be indirectly or directly encouraged or pushed backwards? So it's back to Syria. So I think it's a very different story.
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned that there were there was a sentence that mentioned that there were also in United Arab Emirates.
Yes,
I didn't
yeah.
know that. Are there expatriates or?
No, those were expatriates. So those were interviews I did in 2015-16 that weren't refugees. Well, they were people who had gone at a different time. Whereas the few handfuls. Well, some people had left from 2011, but they had some sort of work permit or were living with relatives. But they weren't refugees who were resettled. No, there have not been refugees that have been accepted as refugees. Yeah. Please.
I have a question.
Yes.
In your interviews, did you ever do follow-up interviews throughout the years with the same individuals, and and also, I guess, if so, how have the politics in those local or their destination countries impacted their view and their outlook in that country versus their desire to kind of go back to this idea of what a homeland is?
Oh, it's a different question. So I have as much as possible done follow-up interviews, but it's strange because one, I think people get tired of being interviewed. They're sort of like, didn't we already talk about this? Are you really going to make me talk about this again? There's also a point, and this is sort of strange in the field work, where people become friends, and they're like, well, wait, now we're having, I met you, we did interviews, but now we're having lunch. You really want to take out a tape recorder? So it's, so the people I've developed relationships, and I've seen their lives have evolved, but it's hard to have a kind of formal interview, oral history setting. I found, maybe because it's too soon, maybe in 5 or 10 years I can go back to people and enough time has passed where I can say, I'd like to record again your narrative of where you're at now. But the few times I have done it, and interestingly, that has typically been with people who I met in a country on Syria's borders who are now in Europe. So that has, there have been several people I met in Turkey or in Jordan who are now in Germany or Sweden, and I've seen them. And it's not just that they are in a totally different environment with a host study or host country, but there's also the life cycle. People's lives have gone on and moved on in ways that are not strictly connected to Syria. The young guys I met who I met in Turkey are now married and have children, and there's a whole, so it's interesting to see that lives move on, and they have different sets of concerns because they're in a very different stage in their lives. And then there are people who I've met who I've gone back and seen in the same country. So there are a few families I've become quite close to in Turkey who are still there. But even there's a daughter of a Syrian family who married a Turkish young man and now has a Turkish-Syrian child and speaks fluent Turkish and things. So it's you see ways in which people cope with challenges and move their lives forward, but also cope with a tremendous amount of loss. And of course still remain connected with each other and remain connected with family back home in Syria. So nearly everyone I've met spends several hours a day on WhatsApp talking to family who are still back home in Syria. But as far as actually returning, I think for many people it just feels absolutely unsafe, totally unpredictable. There are now plenty of stories of people who've returned who've been arrested or detained or disappeared. And it's highly uncertain what could happen. Yeah.
I have a question relating to your methods and strategies. But how did you choose the people you were going to interview, and how did you choose the location within a city, and explain the interview process of that before talking with them?
Great. So and even to this day, I still feel like I'll talk to anybody I can. So it's the sort of only constraint there is I've always been introduced to a new interviewee through another person of trust. So I cannot even imagine how people cold interview people on the street and so forth. I've always worked through somebody else, and that's been totally crucial for me in terms of some kind of trust. And that, so people might not know who I am, what I'm doing, what my motives are, but because they trust this other person who said, she's okay, talk to her. Often they'll talk to me only out of a sense of obligation to their friends, like, okay, to do you a favor, I'll sit down with her and so forth. And working from that one person to another. But that way, so it's not just sort of repeating people from the same family or people from the same town and so forth, is I try to use sort of as many different entryways into that, which essentially means asking everybody I cross paths with for a favor. Can you introduce me to somebody? Could you introduce me to someone? And that might be in German. I meet a German family that's tutoring Syrian families in German. Oh, can you ask your and then, okay, the guy I'm tutoring said that you can talk to him and his family. So you go that way. Or when you're staying in Jordan and you ask the landlord, do you happen to know? Yeah, my cousin's next door neighbors is a Syrian family, maybe you can talk to them. So it's sort of asking everybody you possibly can. You just feel this giant sort of leech of asking people for favors. And then you let it go everywhere possible. If someone's willing to talk to them. So that's how I've done it. And then in terms of where the actual sort of physical site of the interview is always left it open to when I'm able to contact someone, usually over the phone, I'm able to get a contact and so forth and call them and say, will you sit with me to do an interview? And then I always say, I will meet you wherever is most comfortable for you. And often that's in a home space, sometimes it's in a coffee shop. There, the only danger is to not have your audio recordings have like blasting Fairuz in the background, which is the quality of, I mean, when you leave it open to say I'll meet you wherever, sometimes the quality is like World Cup and so sometimes there's a lot of background noise. But at a home, you could have, every 2 minutes a 3-year-old comes in and mama, so yeah. But for the most part, I think wherever a person is most comfortable to speak, freely and feeling safe and feeling comfortable and for their own convenience, that's, I think, is a nice, the least that we can do when the person's offering us their time and opening their hearts to us. Yeah.
Can you break down for us the locations of where people were from that you interviewed? So I know you mentioned Aleppo and Idlib, but
Right.
what about the rest of the country? Did you get a good map of people from different places? And then just the second question is, did you get anyone asking if this was going to be translated to Arabic just so they could see their story being told? Is there anything in the works for that?
I wish there were. So that's the last question is the process of, the publisher has rights to translations and has worked to try to, because it's also the publisher's interest, have it translated in as many languages as possible. And there was actually a Saudi-based publisher that had expressed interest in translating it, and then like 9 months later, that fell through. So there was the hope to be an Arabic translation, but that has unfortunately not worked just because we haven't had any success in finding an Arabic publisher that would want to purchase the rights and invest in translating it and then actually publishing it. Unfortunately, because I would love to see it in Arabic. I think linguistically it would be complicated because a lot of these interviews were translated from Arabic to English, then they'd basically probably be working on the English version of the text to go back to Arabic, so it'd be complicated, not impossible, but messy. But unfortunately, that's not in the works. There is in works a translation to Japanese, so that should come out this summer. And I just had to write the preface from the Japanese edition. But as of now, that's probably will not help most of the people I interviewed. But who knows? So yes, and I haven't. I'm in the process. One thing in writing this, I didn't do a completely systematic kind of a coding. But Michelle, I'd love to talk to you because I'm finally beginning to use the software in vivo actually to do a kind of systematic line-by-line coding in a way also that would help me to do statistically exactly how many people do I have from each province. I did this in a way that I was wanting to get it out quickly, and now I'm going back and doing the kind of real exacting work that I did. So I can't give you numbers, but for sure I think to talk to people from all of the provinces. Some are more represented than others. So certainly, I mean, in Turkey, a lot of people from Aleppo, but a lot of people from the Damascus suburbs. And since I started out 2 summers in a row in Jordan, talked to a lot of people from Daraa. And so that some people are less represented. Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor are sort of less represented, but there are for sure. And that's the nice thing is I mean, even in this past summer, clicked into one family from a village in Deir ez-Zor, and that just opened up my Deir ez-Zor networks a little bit, just talk to my cousin and so forth. And so those are a little bit less represented, but for sure have been able to cover at least a handful of people from each of the areas.
Thank you.
A lot of from cities as well. Yeah, yeah.
So you talked about it a little bit in the book, but can you talk about how using your Arabic was so critical to kind of connecting with people and how that made the book kind of come about a little bit easier rather than going through an interpreter or translator?
Yeah, and I could not imagine doing this kind of work with an interpreter, because I think that the magic happens when there is a space of trust and really kind of a space of intimacy where I'm able to look that person in his or her eyes and looks at me and it's I'm following and there's a connection that's going through. That were it through an interpreter, not only would I not know if what was being interpreted was correct and so forth, but would I could create an entirely different dynamic. So one thing that I think is interesting is Arabic was absolutely totally crucial, but also being a foreigner I think in some ways helped, because people maybe assumed, would maybe describe things in a kind of elaborate detail that they might not to another Syrian. So another Syrian might assume, you know this already, I know this, you know this, so why do I need to tell you that we used to say the walls have ears. But to a foreigner, it's we used to say that the walls have ears. Oh, really? So there was a kind of, both to be able to express in a native language, but a kind of space to even express the minutiae that you only think maybe someone who is not familiar with the context would even have to know and be articulated with. But yeah, it was totally, as a space of trust, as a space of understanding. I could not imagine having done the work otherwise. There were some interviews in English. It was always sort of up to the interviewee, and some people's English was fantastic and made it all the easier to transcribe later. But for sure, being able to leave it to people to express. Because I think another thing is that it wasn't just what people said that were often amazing stories, but how they expressed it. That for me, that was always beautiful in many ways, poetic and expressive. And it's one thing to say, we lived in an authoritarian regime. It's another thing to describe what it felt like to go into a police station or something. But it would be very difficult to do if it wasn't the person wasn't speaking in the language that felt most authentic.
So I'm a PhD candidate in the government department.
Oh, great.
So I'm going to ask a little bit of a social science question.
Sure.
So obviously, you're only able to interview people that are outside of Syria.
Yeah, of course.
Because
Yes.
it's really difficult to get in. And make a caveat at the beginning that they're probably more likely to be against the regime than pro Bashar al-Assad. But
Yes.
I was wondering what kinds of ways that they might have differed, other ways, systematically than the kinds of people that decided not to leave Syria. Like, are they more represented in a particular socioeconomic class? Do they have other types of gender? I mean, all these other aspects.
Right, absolutely. And these are things that I, again, haven't sort of documented systematically to know exactly what, try to estimate what effect it might have and that sort of thing. But for sure, people need a minimum of funds to get out of Syria in the first place. And that, of course, has changed over time. Now the borders are largely closed, so to get out, you're needing to bribe Turkish guards at the border in order to get up beyond that wall or whatever in the first place. So you need a minimum of resources because it costs money to get yourself out of Syria. So that's for sure, there's a class dimension. A gender dimension is interesting to the point that at this point, over time, an increasing number of people who have left have been young men trying to evade government conscription in the army. So and that, you can look at the numbers, and that also depends. There's also I see the kind of intersecting sort of variables about the demographics of who gets out of Syria and the demographics of who winds up where. So in Europe, the first wave, the big 2015 wave, was predominantly male because people had to rally a certain amount of funds to pay smugglers to go the boat journey across the Mediterranean to get to Europe, and of course people were risking their lives and so forth. Was often those who were more physically able and so disproportionately young men. But now with family reunification, you have, so for example, I looked at the Germany statistics that in 2015 the numbers were way disproportionately male over female Syrians, and now the last wave it's actually shifted because the only new Syrians who are getting to Germany are those through family reunification programs, so they might be the wives of the men who went earlier, so forth. So that's always shifting over time, but are real variables there. So there's gender, there's class, and of course class might vary with education to a certain degree. And then there's also, of course, the question that think of the class and education in terms of who gets out of Syria and then who is able to, of course, move on to Europe, just like an extra question of expense. Those who are barely struggling to make ends meet, to pay a landlord for a tent in Lebanon are not moving on to Sweden unless they are brought as a resettlement, but they weren't going to be able to pay their own way. Not, of course, always, but disproportionately less likely to be able to pay their own way to get to Europe in the 2015 wave. So all of those things are things to take into account, where people are and who they are. So it's just almost like a mosaic of variables, and maybe one reason I'm sort of focusing on the storytelling element is to really sort through those in a systematic way and qualify what you know and what you don't know based on who you talk to and where is a really messy thing to cut through, but at least we can be aware of because there's certain patterns that you can safely safely identify. So I guess the young men who are leaving, so now people sometimes talk about some areas of Syria where it's just like older people and women. I remember a guy from Hama was like, we just call it the town of widows, that there's just the women and older folks and young men have left. So it's interesting to think about both those who have left and who's left behind. Of course, these are huge generalizations and there's exceptions to all of them, but those patterns exist. So they take into account.
Did you interview people in Syrians in Egypt? Because I know there's a quite good number there, and they are prospering surprisingly. You know, they're into the catering business and carpenting and stuff.
And things.
They're very very talented people in that, but they did well because my sister is in Egypt. She lives in Egypt. She's a grandmother now, but so she told me that they're really prospering. So although the Egyptians are not very welcoming, culture for foreigners.
So I haven't been
refugees.
I haven't been to Egypt. I have talked to people who were once in Egypt but have moved on. But that's sort of a self-selection, because the ones who I met in Europe who once lived in Egypt were having a really bad time in Egypt, and that's why they left. And many of them describe a situation that surrounded, the 2013 coup, that they came before that. And there's often a narrative that things were pretty good under Morsi, and then there was a turn that was taken when Sisi came to power, and that it was a less hospitable place for Syrians. But certainly there are people, I think in every place people have been able to squeak out some find opportunity for themselves and have experiences that are more positive than negative. But it isn't the place where I've done the fieldwork, unfortunately. So there's another hand, Miss.
I really enjoyed how you edited the stories, the beauty, especially of the very short, like one sentence excerpts, which people rarely do. I wanted to ask you a couple of methodological questions. First, how you presented this project to the people originally when you were interviewing them, like who are you and what did you tell them you were doing? And at the end of the process, what have you shared with them? Did you bring them back their original testimonies? Did you share transcripts? How have you kind of returned the favor other than writing this amazing book, which is a great favor?
No, thanks. So in the first waves when I did this work in 2012 and 2013, I thought it would be much different than it wound up being. So I began this in a much more sort of social scientific an approach, that because I'd studied social movements in my first books on Palestinian mobilization, that I was thinking this would be a political science work around the question of how do people come to protest or participate in high-risk dissent. And I came with this expression, the barrier of fear broke, or breaking the barrier of fear. And I was fascinated by that expression, and I wanted to do research on that expression and what that meant, because it was really what it meant to participate in tremendously high-risk protests. So I began then telling people I was a political scientist professor, and I was doing this work on breaking the barrier of fear, and my initial questions were only basically, what does this expression mean to you, breaking the barrier of fear, and if it happened in your own life, how, and why, and when? And I found that this opened a full range of discussions about both the fear that was broken and how it broke and what that meant, and these were sort of these long narratives about the uprising. I unfortunately never got to the point where I thought I would have my grand theory of explaining high-risk dissent, that I had any answer to this question in the end. What I had was lots of stories. And as time went on, and Syria became this war, and the story moved on, and I realized that this moment of this breaking in 2011 was just one part of the story. And I've still written sort of smaller articles about that. In particular, that was just one piece of a story that was going on much longer and becoming more complicated, and I also wanted to document that. So at that point, sort of realized that I wanted to write something larger, kind of an oral history of the Syrian uprising. So at that point, I would say basically I'm writing, or I guess I'm putting a book of personal stories of the Syrian uprising and war, and that's how I've presented it ever since. But now I present it as I've already written this book, and I want to keep going. I want to keep going with the process of documenting people's stories and any element of experience that's a part of this. So how's it getting back? So one is by the time I got a sense of what the book would look like, anybody who I was still in touch with, I got back in touch with, this purpose, show them the excerpt of the interview that I was planning on using, and at that point ask, would you like to be used with your real name or not? When I began this process, it didn't even occur to me that anybody would want to use their real name. In general, I was like, this is anonymous, I'll give you a number, initials, I'll make them up. I didn't even ask, would you like to have your real name, because it was not even on the, it just was a non-question for me. As time went on, I found that some people actually really wanted their name to be used. They were writing and telling their own stories in different forums. They wanted to claim their story. So anyone who I was no longer in touch with, I gave a pseudonym, but anyone I was in touch with, I gave them the option if they wanted to claim their stories. Because some people who are in the book have been quite vocal in telling their stories in other ways and are in documentaries with their name and their face, and I wanted to give them that option. So at that point they read the excerpt that I used, and when I got their approval that they were happy with that, and they wanted to have their name used. Since then, I mean, anyone I am able to still see, I bring a copy of the book to. I haven't shared full transcripts. You know, that's an interesting question. I can go back and ask people if that's something that they would like. They're often there's still, you know, have the full ums and grammatical this and that, and kind of not necessarily so readable in their rawest form. But that's, I think in many ways it's all gone so fast that I haven't had the chance to really go back to people if they want a full transcript. But I think that would be interesting to see. For the most part, I've been giving people a copy of the book that they're part of. But I still have all of these things. I still have the audio. I still have the transcript, and it's there's still a lot that I think can be done. I'm still playing with these, how to share these and make these accessible to other people, how to do that in a way that's safe and doesn't, given concerns about confidentiality and anonymity and the uncertainty of what's still going, how to somehow be a part of. And I've talked to other colleagues who are involved in Syrian oral history work. Many people, I think, are struggling with how to create oral history archives that are publicly accessible, but not knowing how to do that in a way that's safe, and we're having conversations about what can be done. You know, it's interesting. No one's ever asked me for a copy of either their audio or their transcript. So I think maybe that's why I haven't followed up to offer it. But that's, maybe I should be more organized in making that available for people and for their own personal records and for their subsequent generations. Yeah, your hand went right away. So
in 20 years ago, I did oral histories
Right.
of Palestinians who left Jerusalem in 1948, and
Yes.
so they were recorded on cassette tapes.
Yes.
Half the people in the room don't know what
Yes.
they are, and those are really easy to make copies of, just like
Okay.
digital ones.
Right.
But I always tried to give them back, if not to the
No.
person I interviewed, because the person I interviewed was usually in their 70s or their 80s, but give them back to the family, because there was always family
Right.
members in the interviews. It wasn't like this private
Yeah.
thing. But that was a very different, because I was talking
Right.
about life before 1948 with them and sort of what happened after 48. So these were actually much more like family memories.
Yes.
And you're not at that stage. So I'm only saying all of this to encourage you to hold on to these
Sure.
and sort of try and keep them attached to the real human that they
Yeah.
belong to, particularly the
Yeah.
digital oral,
Yeah.
not so much the text, but because, you know, in 20 years, somebody, you know, a child may want to hear the voice of their mother, right, telling these
Right.
stories. And I mean, I just think you're gonna, this project has such a potential to take you into a future that is in some ways like completely undone before, right?
Yeah.
Because of the way digital
Right.
preservation, et cetera, and recordings goes. And so that, you know, 20 years from now, it would be interesting to have this conversation where you're handing out and having further conversations and sitting around drinking tea and laughing with people or crying with people about their stories and remembering that.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind as a future research trajectory to.
No, thank you. And it occurs to me especially, I mean, there at least, you know, one person who I've interviewed who has since passed away, and his family is now scattered in different places, but I don't know if they have how many recordings of, you know, their grandfather their grandfather's voice and telling his own story. So there's so many things left to do. I think that up until now, because there's been this sort of political mission of I've written this and I still feel like it was urgent to express the basics to people who are not familiar with Syria, what is happening there, and then write the book and talks sort of surrounding it. That there's been a public awareness raising mission that has been on the forefront of my mind in the whirlwind of the past year and a half since this came out. But there's still a lot of work to do, and luckily all the materials are still there. It's just finding the time and the organization to do it in a way that's proper. But thank you. This all reassures me that it has to be a priority too. So there's on the checklist of many things, but they're all there. They're all preserved. It's just maybe you need to hire someone more organized than I am. So is there anyone who didn't have a chance to ask a question? I'll give them that.
So as an anthropology student listening in cultural anthropology, I just wanted to ask what you think anthropology, especially American cultural anthropology, which has always, well, at least since it was founded in Colombia, has always taken a stance to protect in some ways or be responsible to the most marginalized. So what do you think that has to offer political science? Because just reading ethnographies have helped me understand economy before, whereas it was a completely different language. So.
Yeah, I think that political science as a discipline, as those of you who study it, is increasingly obsessed is not a nice way to put it with methods, but in many ways a sort of quest to be scientific. It drives even the questions people ask and the projects they undertake to be scientifically robust in a way that's increasingly identified only with quantitatives, and now it's experiments is sort of on the rise of political science, putting people in experimental settings and giving them as well as game theory and mathematical models and so forth. So it's easy to lose sight that politics is about real people, and I hope that political science doesn't. And there's always, I think it's a sort of dialectic that discipline goes in a way that's sort of super scientific, and then there's a sort of backlash to it, and both qualitative methods, but sort of a more human grounding, and then it swings back and forth. So I think that the discipline has its own sort of identity crises. But personally, I'm sort of adopt the point of a political science point of view of trying to explain causally relationships in the political world, explain why things are the way they are, which is an emphasis on causality, which is, I think, ultimately what political science most wants to get at, is not just what the meaning of things, but explaining causes and effects. But you can do that in a way that's also deeply grounded in lived experiences. That's personally what I've tried to sort of wet. And I think in a work like this, in my mind, I still have a host of political science questions. Like, for example, why do people participate? What drives people to participate in high-risk dissent? How does repression affect protest dynamics? These are all sort of why questions that political scientists ask, but rather than running a model or collecting events data, you can also talk to people who've experienced protest and experienced repression and begin to glean from many stories patterns about how repression affects protest, or what drives someone to take risks that they didn't imagine before, or under what conditions people flee. So personally, I try to sort of have a bit of a foot in both worlds, which might mean you just fall through the cracks of both. But I think that that disciplines offer different ways of asking questions and different ways of viewing the world, and there's a lot to be gained by by sampling from one or another, or learning from what other disciplines have to offer. So I would hope that my fellow political scientists read anthropology and learn from it, and try to integrate it in their own approaches. Please, yeah.
I in a similar boat as you, that I did my bachelor's degree anyway in political science. Found through in political science that it answered some questions, but not all the questions I was having. And this summer I'll be doing my thesis research, most likely doing some oral history interviews in Egypt about the 2011 uprising. And And so I just wondered how you got people to kind of buy into your project, because it is really hard to convince someone who's thinks these fields of social sciences need to be distinct, and they don't really want to mix the different methodologies from other fields.
You mean to how to get someone from a discipline to buy in, or the people you're actually?
From the discipline, how to get
Yeah.
political science to buy into this chronicles.
Oh, I don't know if I have. There's a point where you do what you do because if you have enough job security to be able to do what you do.
I don't.
I know, I understand. And I feel also, someone that I feel like my own personal stories jump through enough sort of political science hoops to sort of feel like you can gain a certain credibility within the realms of the discipline, and then you could push the boundaries. And of course, that's not necessarily the greatest advice, because it seems like a long way off before you get to do what your heart is really in. So I'm not sure what the solution is there, but hopefully with enough creativity, you can find some kind of balance. Ultimately, I think what's important more than any method per se is that you believe in what you're doing, that you think it's compelling, that it has something to offer, that it's important. And there's not a single method for doing that, but if you believe that what you're doing matters, and then whatever method allows you to do that, and there's this certain disciplinary game playing. But I think there's no one way to do something that's valuable, but you have to believe in it. There's one hand in the back row. Yeah, just because you yeah.
I know. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for this. This was amazing. So my question is about your recent interviews in Germany.
Yes.
I know that language is one of the main barriers, but I know there's a lot of more barriers there, compassion fatigue, other things.
Yeah.
Have those been coming up in your interviews, and how are the Syrian refugees kind of dealing with those obstacles there?
Thank you. It's such an interesting place, and I spent the last 3 summers in a row. So each summer I came back sort of having in my mind what were the challenges of the previous summer, and can already see it moving. So my first time there, the first summer 2016, the overwhelming focus was on bureaucracy. Because many people were still in the asylum process, were waiting to hear back. The paperwork, this remains an issue, but it was, at this point, overwhelming people's lives because they were still very much deep in the asylum process. So the confrontations with the German bureaucracy, the paperwork, the red tape, the needing 1 million signatures to get that signature before that signature before that signature. Bureaucracy was kind of the dominating experience. Because many people were just sort of beginning language. Then the issues of language and slowly going through A1, A2, B1, B2, and that sort of thing. The last summer I was there, people were much more talking about work, which makes sense. In the beginning, there wasn't so much talking about work because people at the beginning, it's moving along this process. With time, I've heard more people talking about issues of sort of the second generation and their kids, and tensions of, will my kids still be Syrian, and or my child laughs at me because I don't speak German, and he already, this 8-year-old already speaks totally fluent German and has to go with me to get a translation at the lawyer, and my child's embarrassed about me, and what's going to happen when my girl is 17 and wants to move in with her boyfriend, and there's all sorts of worried about children and so forth. Issues of family reunification are enormous, so you can see an absolute distinction between people who are there with their families or people who have the gut-wrenching uncertainty of being separated from spouses or children or parents. So that remains an overwhelming concern, and you can see a real difference between people who are unable, how to move forward and even think about jobs and so forth if you're emotionally, your family's sliced in two. So that's, I think, an enormous concern for many people. With the movement towards work, as I was sort of hinting at before, I've been very interested by the differences of people having different professional backgrounds, that, and especially sort of middle class, university educated professionals, some of whom are amazingly working in their field. I have a doctor I've become close to who I met in Jordan, who is now fully fluent in German and trained, is licensed as an orthopedic surgeon working in Frankfurt. But many people are struggling with the reality of maybe not having to shift work completely, and then not knowing what to do and having to reinvent and be at an age where it's hard to reinvent yourself. So that's those are issues that I didn't see the first summer when people were just trying to make it through the line and get into the door of the ministry, and now the reality. And of course the uncertainty of will we ever go home, and now families spread out across continents, some families still in Syria, some family in Turkey, some family in different countries, and when will we ever see each other again? So there's a whole host of issues. I think it's really evolving as step by step, but there's a host of issues, and nostalgia, and of course the difficulty with the host countries as well. And some people, and I found differences in people in the former East Germany and former West in terms of what you're meeting German friends, or feeling like you get stared at the bus. Are you either a radical Islamist terrorist or a sexual predator, or have come here to steal our money? All the sorts of tensions of a host society that's also grappling with this question of refugee integration. The question of what integration is enormous debate in German society, and I think the newcomers are also having their debate about what integration is or should be. So it's a tremendously interesting experiment that's really dynamic. And again, I think we're seeing something now that maybe in 20 years or 30 years, for sure is going to be in a very different place. And it is interesting to document these beginning stages of a kind of diasporization, because who knows where it will lead. So, thank you for allowing that last.
Oh, yeah, sure,
question
of
to
course.
give.
Well, let's thank Wendy very much for